Of the Exeter Historical Society. I'm Barbara Rimkunis, Co-Executive Director. Tonight's program takes place in Misquamscook, now called Exeter, in Nadakina, the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the Alnabak, the people who have stewarded Nadakina and its Aki, Nibi, Olaquikak, and Oahuasak, the land, the waterways, flora, and fauna throughout the generations. I'm going to turn it over now to Laura Martin.
Thank you, Barbara. Obviously, my name is Laura Martin, and I'm the co-executive director of the Exeter Historical Society, and I'm glad that you are with us either in person or virtually. Thank you for coming to hear about the New Hampshire Loyalist experience during and after the American Revolution. What a great and somewhat ironic way to kick off the 250th anniversary of American independence. I'd like to thank Exeter TV for bringing all of our programs to our members and friends virtually, for which we are always grateful. Tonight, after our program, we will hold a short annual meeting, and we ask that our members stay so that we can quickly vote on a new slate of trustees and our updated bylaws. Thank you in advance. And that also goes for anyone on Zoom. Tonight, if you'd like to ask a question and you're here in person, please raise your hand after the program and wait for one of us to come with a microphone. Not only will it help our speaker hear you, but it will also help those online hear you. And if you are on Zoom, please put your question in the comments section, and I will do my best to ask it on your behalf. And now for the main event. Our speaker tonight is Eleanor Strang. She is the retired director of the Kelley Library, the public library of Salem, New Hampshire. For the past 11 years, she has been developing and teaching history courses for the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. In fact, she comes highly recommended to us by one of our volunteers who's taken several of her classes. Thank you, Eleanor.
Thank you very much, Laura. So it's awfully nice to see all of you here. I'm glad that you're open-minded to hearing about the other side of the American Revolution. I know Exeter is very proud, justifiably, of its Revolutionary War history. I'm from Boston, so I know what that's like. So now we're going to be looking at the other people, the other side of the coin. So let me just ask for a quick show of hands. How many of you feel that you learned very little about the Loyalists when you were in school? Okay. Yes, I feel the same way. Learned very, very little about them. And that's typical, I think, of all of us. So this is a chance to get to know them a little bit better. They may have been not on the right side of history, but they were not evil people, so it's good to learn a little bit more about them. So, a little bit about terminology first. The Loyalists called themselves Loyalists, or Royalists, or the King's Men. The Patriots called them Tories. The Loyalists didn't like that term. The Loyalists, in turn, called the Patriots rebels and traitors. Needless to say, the Patriots were not crazy about that. So tonight, I'm going to use the term for each group that each group preferred. So we've got the Loyalists and we've got the Patriots. So, as we just demonstrated by our show of hands, this group, the Loyalists, have been largely ignored by American history. They were the losers, and history is written by the winners, so we don't know too much about them. One of the things we typically don't know, or maybe younger people learned it this way, I'm not sure, I did not, is that the Revolutionary War was our first civil war, okay? families divided amongst themselves on opposite sides. So this is very much of a civil war, although not usually portrayed that way. And we have, of course, an example from our founding fathers of that very fact. Who am I talking about? Yep, that's right. Benjamin Franklin and his son William. Benjamin Franklin, we all know. William was his beloved son for most of William's boyhood, adolescence, and early manhood. But when it came to the Revolution, they parted company. Ben never forgave William. William was willing to have a rapprochement with his father, but Ben would have none of it. Ben felt very strongly that William's first loyalty should have been to him as his father, not to his political principles. So they never reconciled. Ben died without them ever reconciling. Yes, it's a very sad story. So what Revolutionary War hero from New Hampshire had Loyalists in his immediate family? John Stark. Yes, very good. Yes, I knew this group would be very knowledgeable. Yes, John Stark. John Stark's brother William was a Loyalist. John Stark's nephew John was a Loyalist. So you might wonder, how did that come about? That's John. I couldn't find a picture of William. Why did William become a Loyalist? He did offer his services on the revolutionary side, but they did not refused to give him the rank he felt he deserved. And he went over to the British, and they made him a colonel. Yeah, so he was a Loyalist. And his son, John, was a member of a Loyalist regiment and actually saw action. So these were John Stark's immediate family on the opposite side. So just a little bit about what kinds of people were Loyalists. This first slide I'm putting in because historians often portray the Loyalists this way. I don't think this is the most useful way to do it. I have a better slide coming right up, but we'll take a quick peek at this. Office holders, well, of course, the royal governors, their immediate entourages. Not surprisingly, they were inclined to be Loyalists. Wealthy merchants and landowners. Well, if you had to bet in a particular case, probably a Loyalist, but boy, there are so many exceptions that really this is not a very good way to differentiate. I mean, look at John Hancock, one of the wealthiest men in the colonies, right? He was a rebel all the way. He financed the activities of the revolutionaries in Boston. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, these are wealthy people, and they were on the revolutionary side. So wealthy merchants and landowners, yeah, but with so many exceptions. Quakers, they were a much more visible group then than they are now, and they were certainly regarded as Loyalists. It's more like they just were neutral. They just could not support war because they can't support war. But they were very much distrusted by the Patriots. And then we have the religious angle. This angle is interesting. Anglicans, members of the Church of England, tended, especially their clergy, to be Loyalists. Excuse me. Allergies. Tended to be Loyalists. The king is the head of the Church of England. The revolution was anti-King George III. So Anglicans might have been inclined to be Loyalists. Their opposite numbers were inclined to be patriots. That would be Presbyterians and Congregationalists. Now, Congregationalists were the direct heirs of the Puritans, right? The Puritans left England because they wanted a more purified version of the Church of England without the Roman Catholic trappings. The hierarchy, the vestments, the liturgy, all of that. Get rid of all of that, plain and simple. So the Congregationalists tended to be patriots because they were already somewhat anti-royal. They hadn't gone all the way with that yet, but they were already inclined in that direction. So we have Congregationalists and Presbyterians very much on the patriot side. What were they thinking? What were the Loyalists thinking? Well, of course, preserve the status quo. That goes without saying. Reforms, not independence. I think this is very important. The Loyalists were not saying, gee, Britain, you're doing a great job. These taxes and import duties are super. Just keep it up. No, they were very much in favor of reforms. But when it came to outright revolution, and outright declaration of independence, no. Many people simply could not go that far. And then the whole idea, this is on an ethical plane, that revolution was treason. They were subjects of King George III of England. Revolution was treason. And then the pragmatic view, which was that the revolution was doomed to failure. Many people thought that, and this is something that one of the Loyalists wrote in a Portsmouth newspaper. We began this controversy on this principle to seek redress of grievances. Since then, we have lost sight of the object and are in quest of what will terminate most certainly in our ruin and devastation. I mean, independency from Great Britain. Can we gain independency? A continent of 1,000 miles of seacoast, defending themselves without one ship of war against 310 battleships, completely manned and fitted? A country that can pay but 30,000 men at war with a nation that has paid and can pay 150,000? So it must have looked, just from a pragmatic point of view, hopeless to a lot of people, a recipe for disaster. And then a lot of people felt that a revolution meant a descent into mob rule and mob violence. They looked at what was happening in Boston. Tarring and feathering was happening there. That's not a myth, and there's nothing funny about it. That's a form of torture. That was happening. One man said that he would rather be ruled by one tyrant 3,000 miles away than 3,000 tyrants 1 mile away. And a lot of people kind of agreed with that whatever was wrong with how Great Britain was treating the colonies was preferable to a descent into mob rule. And then the whole idea, of course, that we needed Britain for protection on sea and on land, their navies and their armies, because Spain and France were constant threats. And of course, family ties and business ties to Britain. There was an awful lot of that. And finally, this is kind of an interesting angle, for Black people, the possibility of freedom from enslavement. Very early in the war, Lord Dunmore, who was the royal governor of Virginia, hit upon the idea of offering to slaves, the slaves of patriots, escape, come over to the British, help us, and at the end of the war, you will be free. Thousands of slaves took him up on that. Far more Black people fought with the British than fought with the patriots. And later on, we're going to see how that all worked out. So, how many Loyalists were in Loyalist regiments? Well, first of all, how many of you knew that there were Loyalist regiments? Not too many, okay. It comes as a surprise to a lot of people. We have Loyalist reenactors, in fact. I did this presentation at one point in one library, and some Loyalist reenactors showed up. And all I saw was men in 18th century uniforms with muskets coming into the room. I wasn't quite sure what their intentions were, but it turned out they were on the Loyalist side, and they were Loyalist reenactors, and they take this very seriously. They were King's Rangers, as a matter of fact. There were a lot of different Loyalist regiments. 25,000 men were in Loyalist regiments during the Revolution. Big figure. Where were Loyalists most numerous? Well, was it here in New England? No, definitely not. We were considered to be, and we were in fact, the hotbed of the Revolution. So, where they were most numerous was basically New York and Pennsylvania, and in some parts of the South. And to people in those areas, the whole idea of the Revolution being a civil war probably makes much more intuitive sense than it does to us. Because we have very few Loyalists. It was not much of a civil war in our area. We're going to see some statistics about that in a minute. But in places like, especially New York, but also Pennsylvania and the Deep South, there were a lot of Loyalists. In fact, Thomas Paine, you know Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense, he wrote about the middle colonies. And he said that, where is it here? I think I have it on the next slide. Why is it that the enemy, the British, have left New England and made the middle colonies their seat of war? The answer is easy. New England is not infested with Tories, and we are. And he was talking about New York and Pennsylvania. So the British did end up making their seat of war New York City. And what Loyalists we had in New England, when they decided they had to flee, their first place of flight was New York City. So once again, I have to point this out. Boston and New York City are on opposite sides, as always. We have it now with the Celtics and the Knicks. Never fails that Boston and New York City are on opposite sides, and they were in the Revolution. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't any patriots in New York City. There were, of course, but they had a lot of Loyalists, and they had more and more as the war progresses because it became a place of refuge for Loyalists. So what happened to New Hampshire Loyalists during the war? Well, one thing that happened was that the Continental Congress had recommended that an association test be given to white men over 21. They would be asked to sign this statement. And here it is. We, the subscribers, do hereby solemnly engage and promise that we will, to the utmost of our power, at the risk of our lives and fortunes, with arms, oppose the hostile proceedings of the British fleets and armies against the United American colonies. With arms. That's treason. 92% of the New Hampshire men who were asked to sign this signed it. 92%. That gives you some idea of the extent to which the Revolution was the side to be on in New Hampshire. Now, of course, we'll never know how many people signed it who were lying through their teeth. I know one for sure. So we don't know that. All we know is that 92% did sign it, 8% refused. Other things that happened to New Hampshire Loyalists during the war. Well, one thing that could happen was indefinite imprisonment without bail or trial. That was in accordance with a law that was passed in New Hampshire in 1777. And that's, well, let's see here. An act was passed in New Hampshire authorizing the Committee of Safety to issue warrants to sheriffs for the commitment to jail of any person whom the said Committee of Safety shall deem the safety of the Commonwealth requires should be restrained of his personal liberty, or whose enlargement within this state is dangerous thereto, there to remain without bail until discharged by order of the Committee of Safety or the General Court. So that's maybe a little frightening, but we do have to remember that the Patriots perceived this as a life and death struggle, and failure would be a very bad option. So were a lot of people imprisoned without bail or trial as a result of this? Not a lot, because frankly, New Hampshire just didn't have the jail capacity. So no, not too many, but some people were. Some people's health was permanently broken by being in an 18th century jail. I'm sure you all know what a unhealthful place a 18th century jail was. So some people were imprisoned as a result of this, but not a huge number. And then there was the Proscription Act the next year. What that said was, if you leave the state and go to where the British are, which typically meant New York City, you cannot come back. So we did not evict the Loyalists, but if they left, they could not return. And it named a number of specific people who had done that, who could not return. The list was headed by the Royal Governor of New Hampshire, John Wentworth. And then there was a subset of that covered by the next law, the Confiscation Law, 1778, which said, if you leave the state and you go to where the British are and you actively help them, we are going to confiscate your property. And they did. And they did. Some people did lose their property as a result of this. Again, it named some specific individuals who had done exactly that, and it also applied to people who might do that in the future. So who are some famous New Hampshire Loyalists? Well, one was a New Hampshire hero from an earlier war. Yes, good, absolutely. Robert Rogers, Rogers Rangers. Everybody remember Rogers Rangers from the French and Indian War? Yep, okay. Well, Robert Rogers ends up a Loyalist in the Revolutionary War. This is a little sketch of him. We have no idea what he actually looks like. But as you can see, he has some indigenous people behind him. He was famous for bringing Indian techniques of war, camouflage, stealth, things like that, into the war of the British against the French and the Indians. The British had a lot to learn. They were not very good at stealth or camouflage, running around in their red uniforms. So Robert Rogers was instrumental in trying to teach the British, and some Americans as well, how to conduct warfare in a sort of a wooded environment, not an open field of battle. So he commanded Rogers Rangers. He spent considerable time in England after the French and Indian War. In fact, probably more than 10 years. The result of that was that when he did come back, he was kind of out of touch with what was going on, and people were very, very suspicious of him because he had spent so much time in England, and they were afraid that he was now a Loyalist. He was distrusted, and he ended up turning to the British, and he ended up commanding the King's Rangers and the Queen's Rangers, 2 Loyalist regiments. Unfortunately, he was an alcoholic, and his alcoholism increasingly got the better of him during the course of his life. He lost the command of both the King's Rangers and the Queen's Rangers, and ended up spending the end of his life in England in obscurity and a drunk, basically. kind of a sad story. Another famous New Hampshire Loyalist, of course, is our royal governor, John Wentworth, the nephew of Benny Wentworth, who was our first royal governor. Now, John was a very popular governor until the Revolution. He was a moderate. He was against the Stamp Act. He tried his best to oppose it. But as the revolutionary fervor increased, he was firmly on the side of Britain and the monarch. So he was definitely a loyalist. I think had the revolution not come around, he would have probably been a very popular governor. But it was his misfortune to end up being royal governor just as the revolution was breaking out. So that didn't work out too well for him. He fled to Boston in 1775. The British evacuated Boston in March of 1776. He went with them, first up to Halifax, then down to New York City, ultimately to England. He did end up organizing a loyalist regiment called Wentworth Volunteers. And after the war, he became lieutenant governor of Nova Scotia. So he landed on his feet, but not where he would have preferred to be. This is another gentleman. I don't know, how many of you are familiar with Count Rumford, Benjamin Thompson? Yes? Okay, good. 2, okay. What? Oh, okay, Rumford, yes. Rumford was an earlier name for Concord. So that's why people with a Concord connection would probably recognize his name very readily. He's kind of a famous guy in science and in many other fields. Born in Woburn, Mass. A rapid social rise on his part, because he married a wealthy widow. This is a very, very good way for an ambitious young man to rise rapidly in the social ladder. So he marries a wealthy widow. He becomes a protege of Royal Governor John Wentworth. Now, people assumed that he was a loyalist, as was John Wentworth. It's very unclear, when you read biographies of Benjamin Thompson, it's very unclear if he was truly a loyalist all along, or whether he kind of was driven to it by the fact that everybody thought he was a loyalist. And they treated him with suspicion. He was, in fact, arrested twice on the charge of being unfriendly to the cause of liberty. But they had to release him because there was no evidence. So we really don't know what was going on in his head in the earlier years. But before too long, he's a loyalist. As I say, he may have been driven to it by the suspicion of his neighbors, or maybe not, but he definitely becomes a loyalist. Goes to England, eventually is knighted, so now he's Sir Benjamin Thompson. He gets the permission of the king to go into the service of the Prince of Bavaria. So he makes all kinds of reforms, both scientific and social, in Bavaria. He also makes advances in weaponry and artillery. He figures out what heat is from the point of view of physics, because that was not well understood at the time. He's kind of a Renaissance man. He's just into everything, and he seems to do whatever he touches very, very well. He ends up becoming a Count of the Holy Roman Empire. So he gets his choice of how to be addressed. So he picks Rumford, the town where he got his start, up the social ladder, and he becomes Count von Rumford. Yeah, I know, this is little Benjamin Thompson from Woburn, Mass. Now he's Count von Rumford. He is one of the founders of the Royal Institution of Great Britain. That is a very prestigious scientific institution for the advancement of scientific research. And I believe it still exists. he seems to not have borne too much ill will toward America, despite how he was treated, because he ended up leaving his military designs to West Point, and he ended up leaving money to Harvard, where he had taken some courses. He left money to Harvard to establish what they call a chair, a professorship in chemistry. And that still exists. And in fact, one of the professors who held that professorship went on to found the Rumford Company that produces, some of you may know this, Rumford baking powder. So there is a sort of a connection, indirect, but there is a connection between our Benjamin Thompson and Rumford baking powder. And I don't know if you've ever heard of Rumford fireplaces. Yes, okay, good. Here is an example. This is an example of him operating on two levels. On a very, what you might call highfalutin level, he's a scholar all the way in physics. But he also applies his knowledge to practical endeavors, including building a better fireplace. So you can see that this is a much more shallow fireplace than the typical rectangular box fireplace that was prevalent at the time. And it has sloping sides. And that is to help force heat into the room. And it has a specially designed throat to pull more smoke up. So his design created less smoke and more heat for the people in the room. And that design still exists. So, what did the Loyalists do after the war? Because they're the losers, right? How many emigrated? Where did they go? The primary place, and we're going to come back to it because it's so important, was Nova Scotia, which at that point included what we call New Brunswick. Okay, that was the largest number of Loyalists went there. Quebec, some did go to Quebec. Britain, during the course of the war, many of the wealthier Loyalists did go to Britain. That did not work out too well for them. Britain was a closed, stratified society, very hard to break into, and not impressed with colonials. So the people who went there tended not to be very happy. And then there was Florida. Boy, did that not work out. Florida had been a Spanish possession up until the end of the French and Indian War in 1767. But at that point, Britain was on the winning side, and Britain acquired Florida from Spain. So Florida was actually a British colony during the Revolution, but it never joined up with the Revolution. It was very, very recent to be in the British fold. So it did not join up with the other 13 colonies. But it looked like a nice haven for Loyalists from the Deep South because it wasn't part of the Revolution. So Loyalists from Georgia, the Carolinas, many of them went there, bringing their large number of slaves with them, hoping to set up the kind of slave-based plantation economy that they were used to. Well, what happened with the peace treaty that ended the Revolution, that was finally signed in 1783, was that Florida was given back to Spain. So now these refugees from the British colonies who were Loyalists, rah, rah, King George, are now in Florida. It's now a property of Spain. And they were supposed to take an oath of allegiance to the Spanish king and possibly have to convert to Catholicism. They were not happy. And so most of them left yet again. Now this is yet another emigration for them, and went to either the Bahamas or Jamaica, hoping again to establish or reestablish a slave-based plantation economy. Now the Bahamas didn't work out all that well either. The soil quality is poor. It's not well suited to agriculture. So their hopes of a plantation economy were not well realized there. Jamaica is very fertile. It was also very crowded. There were already a lot of sugar plantations there. There was not a lot of available land. So the Loyalists who went there had a lot of trouble breaking into that closed society. So those destinations didn't work out all that well either. So, as I say, I'm going to get back to Nova Scotia in just a minute. But in terms of actual totals, 67,000 Loyalists are accounted for by the figures up there. The actual total of Loyalists who left is probably considerably higher. Most historians say it was somewhere in the 80 to 100,000 range. But we don't really know very much about the people who went on their own. What we know about is the people who went somewhere with the help of the British who kept records. So anything over 67,000 is a bit of a guess. But conservatively, 80,000, maybe as much as 100,000 people left. The people most apt to leave were the people who were in Loyalist regiments, because they were very identifiable as having been Loyalists, and their families. So a lot of the Loyalists were former members of Loyalist regiments. So how did they go? And what was the role of a man named Sir Guy Carleton, General Sir Guy Carleton? Before I talk about him, I just want to say that please don't confuse Carleton with Bannister Tarleton. Does the name Tarleton ring a bell? Yes, okay. And probably not in a good way. No, no. Tarleton was a British officer in the South, and he's infamous because in at least one, maybe more, of the battles that he was involved with the Patriots, his men killed Patriot soldiers who were trying to surrender. Yeah, so Tarleton is infamous and very much associated with that. So Carleton is not that man. Sir Guy Carleton, General Sir Guy Carleton, is a very different kettle of fish altogether. He's my favorite person on the Loyalist British side of the equation. He's my favorite person. He, poor guy, ends up being given command of the British forces in America in 1782, at which point the war has already been lost by Britain. So he is in charge of essentially a mop-up operation. He has to evacuate the troops, but he also wants to evacuate the Loyalists who are still left behind. And most of those Loyalists, as I mentioned, have been congregating all during the war to New York City. So this is where the big operation is going to take place. Carleton assembles a fleet of 183 ships to bring thousands of people up to Nova Scotia. Now, as I'm sure you know, a sailing ship of the 18th century cannot carry very many passengers, right? We're not talking about a cruise ship with thousands of passengers here. They can maybe carry 200, if that. So many ships and multiple trips are necessary to bring 30-some-odd thousand Loyalists up to Canada. And they start, for the most part, they start in April of 1783, and the operation continues until November of 1783. It's a long, kind of drawn-out operation, and the troops are still in New York City. And Congress sends a message to General Carleton. Continental Congress sends a message to General Carleton saying, basically in our parlance, what part of you lost the war? Now go away. Are you not understanding? Leave. And he says, I would show an indifference to the feelings of humanity as well as to the honor and interest of the nation I serve to leave any of the Loyalists who are desirous to quit the country a prey to the violence they have so much cause to apprehend. Nope, he's not leaving till he gets all of the Loyalists in New York City who want to leave, he gets them out of there to safe havens. General Washington is not happy with this. And Carleton and General Washington have one meeting. A couple of topics are brought up. One is the slow pace of the evacuation of the British from New York City. And Carleton says the same thing to General Washington that he just said to the Congress. The other is that George Washington is very upset that black people, former slaves, are being transported by the British up to Canada. And he points out that the peace treaty specifically says the British are not supposed to carry off the property of Americans. And these former slaves are the property of Americans. And Carleton says, no, they're not. They are British subjects. We promised them their freedom if they fought on our side. They did do that. We are honor-bound to honor that promise, and he does. So he transports some several thousand former slaves up to Nova Scotia. The compromise that they kind of work out, although it's more of a paper compromise than anything, is that a record will be kept of those former slaves who are transported up to Canada. It was called the Book of Negroes. And it would identify each of those former slaves by name, physical description, where were they from, and who was their owner. The idea being, in theory, that the owners, since there was a record, could obtain some sort of compensation for their slave property from the British. In point of fact, that did not happen. But the existence of the Book of Negroes kind of was a face-saving way out of this dilemma between the two generals. When these former slaves got up to Nova Scotia, they encountered not just discrimination, but also a certain amount of persecution from the American Loyalists who were there. And some of them became so disheartened, some of the former slaves became so disheartened that they, in the early 1790s, took Britain up on its offer to transport them yet again to Sierra Leone on the west coast of Africa, where Britain was trying to set up a kind of a colony. And roughly 1,000, a little more than 1,000 former slaves did do that, went out over to, were transported over to Sierra Leone, founded Freetown, which still exists, which in fact thrived, and kind of started a new country. So that's kind of yet another surprising result of all of this displacement of the Loyalists. So, going back now to Nova Scotia, what did Britain do for the Loyalists, right? Well, transportation, I just covered that. Land grants, free land. The Acadians, the French-speaking Catholics, had been evicted from Nova Scotia. If you've read Evangeline, you know something about this. And their land was kind of up for grabs, and Britain would love to have English-speaking people taking over that land, so they offered it to the Loyalists, who took it. Britain also promised building materials, farm implements, arms and ammunition, medicine, and provisions for the first year. Britain did follow through on those promises, but none of it was enough. None of it was enough. We're talking 30-some-odd thousand people who are very ill-prepared for a Canadian winter and so forth. There's just not enough of anything to help them. Britain also set up something called the Royal Commission that was going to investigate what these Loyalists had lost and hopefully compensate them, at least to some degree. The Royal Commission held hearings for 6 years. They listened to over 3,000 claims and ultimately awarded a total of about £3 million to the people who were making claims for the property that they had lost as a result of being Loyalists. Now that, on the average, worked out to £1,000 per claim, but it was very unevenly distributed. Somebody like Royal Governor John Wentworth did quite well. Some poor farmer who had trouble verifying his losses without a big paper trail would not do quite so well. So I think what you could say there is that Britain did make quite an effort to compensate Loyalists for their losses, but it wasn't quite enough, especially for a lot of the smaller people. So what impact did the Loyalists have on Canada? Well, historians say that before 1783, Canada was mostly a French colony under British rule. Not exactly a recipe for stability or happiness, right? And this is the map as of 1783. So you can see NS Nova Scotia, which includes New Brunswick. New Brunswick didn't yet exist as a separate entity. It was part of Nova Scotia. You also can see this enormous, weirdly shaped province of Quebec, right? Okay, so that's as of 1783. As of 1791, after the Loyalists had been in Canada for just a few years, Nova Scotia is subdivided, and New Brunswick is now a separate colony, separate province, separate from Nova Scotia. So we have Nova Scotia and we have New Brunswick, two separate entities. That was because the Loyalists who ended up in what we now call New Brunswick said to Britain, we do not want to keep going to Halifax, Nova Scotia to transact government business. It's too far. We need to be our own province and have our own capital, which would be more convenient for us. And Britain said, okay. And New Brunswick was born 1 year after the Loyalists got there in 1784. Didn't take long for the Loyalists to start redrawing the map. Then we have what happened with the former province of Quebec. That is also subdivided. And we have Upper Canada and we have Lower Canada. It's upper and lower from the point of view of the flow of the St. Lawrence River. Otherwise, that doesn't make much sense. So Upper Canada, which is now basically Ontario, that is where a lot of the English-speaking Loyalists ended up. Lower Canada, especially this part here, is where the French people already were, right? So we now have another new province. So we have New Brunswick and we have another new province, Upper Canada, and Lower Canada has been kind of renamed. So the map of Canada is changing very quickly after the Loyalists get there. So what was the Loyalists' impact on Canada? Created two new English provinces, New Brunswick and Upper Canada, strengthened the English element in British North America as a whole. British North America is what Britain called Canada. Before 1783, the continuance of Canada in the British Empire was by no means assured. After 1783, the imperial tie was well knit. And I have a little quote about Canadians. Within a generation, the new Canadians had spread across the vast British dominion. Granted large tracts of land, they transformed a wilderness into a vibrant nation. Many became prosperous farmers or started large mercantile dynasties. Seldom has a people done so well by losing a war. Today, about 15% of the population of Canada can claim an American Tory ancestor. So they disappear from our textbooks, from our collective memory, right? But the Loyalists play a very important role in Canadian history. And I'll just close with this. This is the coat of arms of the province of Ontario. And some of it is pretty obvious. Obviously, the animals are native to Canada. We've got a bear, a moose, and a deer. We have St. George's Cross, red on white, that's Britain. We have, of course, the maple leaves, Canada. And what's most interesting is the motto in Latin, ut incepit sic permanet fidelis. As it began, so it remains, loyal. So how we do, we don't have very much time, but we do have a little bit of time. Where's Laura? There you are. So questions and answers, do we have time for that?
Yes.
Okay.
And actually, I have one from online, from our Zoom audience.
Okay.
So what can you tell us about the use of Patriot homes in the Exeter area, which were used to house exiled Loyalists as prisoners/guests from other colonies, notably Quakers from Dutchess County, New York?
Okay, I know nothing whatever about that, and I would rely on you folks as Exeter historians to tell me what are we talking about. We had houses in Exeter that housed Loyalist prisoners, Loyalist guests. What are we talking about here?
I just read the question. I don't know the answer.
Does anybody know what we're referring to here?
Yes, we got some Tory prisoners in from New York State. I do not recall them being Quakers. They were sent here overland and traveled into Exeter. Our jail at the time was on the other side of Chestnut Street, which was called Prison Street. And we had the world's worst prison,
yes,
because anybody could escape from it.
Yes.
So when the Loyalists arrived, they were told to try and find boarding accommodations within the town. Many of these men were paroled home because they had families. So I don't think they were considered to be a high risk. I think that they were just being reminded that you need to be loyal. And that's mostly what I know about
Okay.
them. So,
to your point, I can actually add something to that. Exeter's prison, I do know something about that. There's a very famous Loyalist. I didn't have enough time to include him among my New Hampshire Loyalists, but his name is Stephen Holland. I don't know if that name rings a bell. Yeah, okay. Stephen Holland, he was a Loyalist all the way. He was a spy for Britain. He was caught. He was imprisoned in the prison here in Exeter. He escaped, of course. He was caught again and imprisoned in Boston, but Exeter wanted him back for whatever reason, and he was brought back in chains. He was brought back in chains to Exeter, to the prison here, escaped again, made his way through a chain of Tory safe houses, kind of like the Underground Railroad, a chain of friendly houses that would shelter fleeing Tories who were wanted. And he made his way to Rhode Island and ultimately to New York. So that's an example of what you just said about the jail. The jail in Exeter is actually kind of famous.
Do we have any other questions? There is a history minute that's going to happen about him. Okay.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. I had a question. I had a Canadian grandmother who would talk about, sort of in a hushed tone, about how she was part of the UE Loyalists.
Yes.
And I don't know if you know,
Yes.
she wouldn't really describe it. It was almost like a secret society sort of thing.
Well, I can tell you something about that. That's United Empire Loyalists. And that was General Carleton's idea, that Loyalists who had fled to Canada during the Revolution or immediately thereafter could have the prestige of having UE after their name, United Empire. And that means that she can trace your family's ancestry back to somebody who left the United States during or immediately after the American Revolution. Yep. And that was Carleton's way of recognizing them. That was a great honor. His intention wasn't, to create something that people had to be hush-hush about. His intention was to create something that people would be very proud of.
Thank you. You mentioned that 80 to 100,000 Loyalists left. How many of us were there here? I mean, Loyalists, so how many Patriots were there?
Good point. The total population of the 13 colonies is estimated to have been approximately 2.5 million. So I don't know whether that sounds like a big figure or a small figure to you. I think of it as a small figure because it's stretched out from New Hampshire down to Georgia, only 2.5 million people. That's the population of Chicago. So that's the total population. So the people who fled, the Loyalists who actually left, are a very small percentage of the total population of the colonies. So as I said, the people most apt to leave were the people who had been involved in some way with a loyalist regiment or had been conspicuous in some way as a loyalist. A lot of people just kind of kept a low profile and kind of hoped for the best. It didn't take long for the fury against them to subside. Once the United States got better established and the period of chaos was ending, the feeling against the Loyalists started to subside. So the people who had kind of hope that nobody would pay too much attention to them, were able to kind of start coming out of their holes and being a little bit more public. But that's a good point, the percentage of the people who left as a percent of the total population. Thank you.
I've got another question from Zoom.
Yes.
Sally Morris says, one of my students wrote a paper on John Phillips, and the implications are that he was a loyalist as well, or maybe played both sides. Do you know anything about this?
I don't know anything about John Phillips, but there were a lot of people who played both sides. I'm sure you've heard John Adams quote that a third of the people were loyalists, a third of the people were patriots, and a third of them were neutral. Well, modern historians don't put much stock by that. What was actually going on is that there was a smaller than a third group who were the real patriots fighting, a smaller than a third, much smaller than a third group who were the real loyalists. And there was this big group in the middle who switched sides depending on who was in the ascendancy at any point in time. So John Phillips would have had a lot of company if he was switching sides. So was probably at least 50% of the population who didn't care very much, who just wanted to basically survive, and whoever seemed to be winning the war at any given point in time, well, I'm a patriot. Oh no, they're not doing well. Oh no, I'm a loyalist, So I think that was a very common thing that happened. We think of passionate patriots and passionate loyalists, but there was this huge group in the middle who just wanted to get on with their lives.
Thank you.
I heard you mention the name Dunmore, and Harbor Island, Bahamas, at one time was the capital of the Bahamas, and Dunmore Town is the town. Was Dunmore English, or was he a loyalist? Or maybe he's not connected.
Well, there's Lord Dunmore. Is that who we're talking about, Lord Dunmore? Boy, the problem is it's a kind of a common name. So Lord Dunmore was certainly on the British side, for sure. But I don't know which Dunmore we're talking about with regard to, did you say the Bahamas? Yeah, I don't know which Dunmore that would be. There are a lot of Dunmores, unfortunately.
On one of your slides, you had the name Jasanoff with a figure.
Yes.
But I'm not sure who that was.
Oh, Maya Jasanoff, she's just the author of a book. Actually, I'm glad you brought that up. The author of a book that's on my bibliography about the Tories. So I'm quoting her. I put her on the bottom of the slide as the source of those figures, because she had done a tremendous amount of research to come up with those figures. But I'm actually glad you asked that question, because Laura and I were talking earlier. I do have a bibliography. I mean, I'm a former librarian, so of course I have a bibliography. They don't let me go anywhere if I don't have a bibliography. So I can email the bibliography as an attachment to Laura. And if any of you are interested, if you just contact or email Laura, she can email it to you, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. And info@exeterhistory.org is our email address.
In regards to the Tories that were sent here from New York to Exeter, I just want to give a shout out to poor Brentwood and Kensington, because they also had to take in some of those Tories as well, in those families. And also here in Exeter, you had Robert Loost Fowle, who was a printer, who was a Tory printer, and he was arrested and committed to jail for a while, and he ended up moving to Brentwood, where he died, I believe, in 1802 or 1803.
Okay.
And he was still an ardent Tory to the day of his death, supposedly.
So he made it through from the end of the Revolution to the early 1800s.
Exactly.
Basically unmolested.
Because, like you said, people did forgive them after time.
They did.
Yeah, but he was a notorious printer right here from Exeter.
Well, I knew I would learn more about Exeter from you folks.
He also escaped from our jail.
Of course he did.
Made it to the British line. Anyone could do it. Do you have any more questions?
Well, thank you so much. You've been a great audience.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. And we would appreciate it if you'd stick around for our annual meeting. There will be a few moments of not quite chaos, but a little bit of working to get the next presentation up. So thank you.